The BBC's first dedicated TV news programme focusing exclusively on Africa launches this coming week. Focus on Africa brings together the BBC World Service's African service and BBC World News, broadcasting to audiences outside the UK. Sophie Ikenye will present the programme alongside Ghanaian-born journalist Komla Dumor, who joins us this afternoon. Welcome to BBC Radio Nottingham.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
How will this new programme make a difference to the way that Africa is currently reported?
Well, I think it's a really significant development for not just the BBC, but for those who've been watching us over the years. I mean, the World Service has had a long history of coverage of the continent, BBC World as well. But many of those issues have focused exclusively on the political events, current affairs, which, clearly are quite relevant. But over the past 2 years, I've been presenting another program called Africa Business Report. I've traveled to close to 20 countries, over 300,000 air miles, talking exclusively about business stories. And they are far more significant at a time like this for Africa and for the rest of the world, indeed, because of the interest the world has in the continent. The continent is changing very quickly, socially, politically and economically, and I think the way in which we tell the African story has to change with it. So starting tomorrow evening, actually, we will have our very first broadcast, but it's really a continuation of the kind of coverage that the BBC has had on the continent for many years.
Now, I know it's a bugbear of listeners of this programme, and mine too, that Africa's often talked about in the news as though it's one homogenous country and not a diverse continent made up of hugely different countries, cultures and communities, as you well know.
That's right.
Are misconceptions like this one of the things the new programme will aim to reflect?
I think that it's important that people recognize that, there are many African countries and they're all making progress at different speeds. There's some that are doing an incredible job of lifting their people out of poverty, and there are others that are still facing a lot of challenges. That being said, there are certain common difficulties that many African countries face, but there are also many success stories as well. So I think what is important, I think what viewers of this program will come to realize is that there is a fair balance of stories. I don't think there's anyone out there who will say that if millions of people are facing starvation in the Horn of Africa, we should ignore it. Or if there's needless suffering of women and children in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we should ignore it. We must tell those stories. Those stories must be heard. However, we also need to talk about the 18,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable that is bringing high-speed internet across the East African coast, what that's going to do for finance, for banking, for education. We also need to talk about the success of countries like Botswana that have been experiencing, economic growth well over 7-8% for the past 30 years. I think De Beers, the biggest mining company in the world, recently moved much of its operations to Gaborone. Some of those stories are not being told, and I think they also deserve a fair hearing, or fair airing, if you like. And Focus on Africa is going to do just that.
Now, you're presenting the programme alongside Sophie Ikenye, and we mentioned earlier for yourself, a Ghanaian-born journalist. Is it important that the coverage of Africa comes from Africans?
I think what is important is that the story is told by experienced journalists. I'm not one of those people who believes that you simply acquire authenticity by having an African name and perhaps being able to speak the language. Those things are important and perhaps they help. But what is really relevant is that the people who are presenting those stories understand the issues.